Are you all safe, dear listeners? On the outskirt of Seoul, today is August 17th, 2035. 5 years had already passed since August 17th, 2030, the day that became a catastrophe for all of humanity. Huge, terrible monsters roamed the streets of the city, roaring in search of prey. Such unidentified monsters began to flow out of perversions that arose all over the world precisely on that day. The speaker assumed that since then, they had sunk to nothing more than game for one meal. But his interlocutor was surprised when he heard such words as the awakened, who tried day and night, would have their hearts pierced by such words. The narrator was surprised that his interlocutor thought so and asked, "Whose merit, then, is it that as many as 40% of humanity still survives?" The MC suddenly looked up from the recording and jerked his head to the side. The voice in his earpiece admitted that he thought it was all thanks to the walls built from reinforced alloys. The protagonist raised himself up, looking over the stone ledge he was hiding behind, and froze in surprise. The man from the recording called his interlocutor shameless, and in the end, they came to the conclusion that the barriers have their limits, because you just need to look around. Overcrowding in safe zones leads to a shortage of basic supplies. The protagonist frowned, noticing the large number of monsters passing by. He counted that there were 6 monsters above Class C and 1 monster of Class A. Everything was as Giles said, and he took out his binoculars to take a closer look at the creatures passing by. Then he looked at the empty space that the monsters were approaching and realized that this meant that the heat was coming soon. Suddenly, a cloud of energy began to concentrate in the empty square, illuminating everything around with a bright flash. This light became brighter and brighter, and the protagonist, who put the binoculars to his eyes again, realized that this was the so-called sudden gate. The energy gradually became more like an elongated portal, and the protagonist was convinced that this was indeed a gate. He also knew about the person who would appear from it, and as soon as he said this, Park Kong-ho jumped out of the bright flash of light. He simply stood in place for a while and then shouted in amazement that he was here. He was glad that he was finally able to return, but his joy quickly turned to horror as he noticed monsters approaching him. He cursed, not understanding what kind of nonsense this was, and asked why these monsters were still here. Junhyuk, meanwhile, sighed in delight, assuming that this was really happening. One of the monsters at that moment raised its paw to attack Kung-ho, and Junhyuk noticed that it was finally starting and smiled happily. Sometime later, as the monsters were making increasingly eerie cries, Kung-ho, covered in blood, froze, breathing heavily. MC understood that in order to face one monster above Class C, it would take a lot of effort. Meanwhile, Kung-ho frowned in concentration, shouting the sword nest spell, and a large number of energy clots resembling swords in shape appeared in the air above him. In order to fight such monsters, at least 10 high-ranking hunters were needed. But Kong-ho was here alone, and he pointed these swords towards the monsters, clenching his jaws from the effort to not lose concentration. When he fully formed the spell, he released the swords at high speed towards the monsters, and the body of one of them was caught in this attack. Kong-ho managed to cut down 6 high-level monsters in just an hour, and he did it all by himself. Another monster he killed fell to the ground in front of him, and he paused to recover a bit. Now he only had 1 A-class monster left, but even if all 5 S-class hunters in the world gathered together, such a task would be impossible. However, despite such a depressing situation, the protagonist smiled enthusiastically as he continued to watch the unfolding battle. Although he had heard about it, he was now surprised at the true power of the Spear Master. Meanwhile, the monster began to concentrate its own magic attack to attack Kong-ho, and the protagonist decided to wait a little longer since he knew what would happen next. Meanwhile, Kung-ho cursed when he noticed the attack formed by the monster, and the protagonist mentally exclaimed that soon this power would belong to him. Meanwhile, the attack flew towards Kung-ho as a powerful beam, but he managed to rise into the air in time with his own skill. He activated Phantom Throw, rushing towards the monster, and then used the Demon Blade, making a large number of cuts. It managed to make a fairly large hole through the body of this monster. The monster fell to the ground, and Junhyuk exclaimed that it was a crazy battle beyond comprehension. He realized that it was time for him to go now and looked at Kong Ho, who fell to the ground, exhausted. One of his arms was missing, and he could not even move. The protagonist soon came down to him and thought that everything was still going, as Jekyll said. He carefully knelt down next to Kong Ho, put his palm on his back, called out to him, and asked about his condition. He remembered that Jekyll had clearly said that he had obtained Kong Ho's power by trying to save him, which meant that if MC helped him, he himself would obtain this power. Kong Ho blushed, spitting out blood, and the protagonist frowned, asking himself how he could save him. He realized that he needed to ask more details. And at that time, Kong Ho opened his eyes slightly and asked what year it was. The protagonist answered that it was August 2035, and Kong Ho sat up, then cursed because the difference was only 5 years, but he spent 30 years in another place, and here only 5 years passed. MC called out to him, advising him not to try to make unnecessary movements, but to just lie down. But Kong Ho knew that it was too late, and Junhyuk thought that he knew it and admitted to himself that he was sorry. But still, Kong Ho was going to die today. Kong Ho sadly lowered his head, cursing because he knew that if he had not spent most of his strength on opening the gate, then everything would have been different. He laughed sadly, and the protagonist looked at him with regret, but said nothing. Kong Ho, meanwhile, pulled out a photo, turning towards the protagonist, and confessed that he had a favor to ask of him. He asked him to find his family and take care of them if they were alive. MC asked in confusion and tried to refuse since it was a little difficult since he himself was not in a position to take care of someone. Kong Ho cried out in pain, but overcame himself and explained that he was not asking the protagonist for free, promising that he would give him the power. MC asked in amazement, but in his mind, he cried out happily since he understood that everything was going according to plan. Kong Ho, meanwhile, added that in order to give the power, he needed the protagonist's name. In this world, which was beaten by catastrophes similar to the apocalypse, there were always two common themes in the life of the protagonist. Before thinking about it, he froze but did not answer. Kong Ho, who meanwhile said his name, asked the protagonist, "What is his name?" In the past, when Junhyuk was older, he was leaning against the shelf and sadly lowered his head. Jonathan Curtis, laughing, was glad that they finally met. It happened in June 2008 in Junhyuk's hideout. He did not answer Jonathan, but thought that the property of irreversibility was applied, and life still goes on. Jonathan ordered him not to even try to dodge like a slimy eel and called him a villain. MC ignored him again and frowned, looking at the wound on his side from which blood was flowing. He knew that he would not be able to escape this time, and asked Jonathan who told him and his comrades that he was here. Jonathan replied that it was the 16th ranked villain, Jin-soo, with whom he had made a deal. Jin-soo gave them the MC data for $1 million and a promise not to pursue him for a year. The protagonist called Jin-soo names, angry at him for doing such a thing. He had experienced the death of his parents, false accusations, prison, a car accident, and then the death of his younger brother and sister. Jonathan pulled out a sword, pointing it at him, and suggested that it was time for Junhyuk to die if he had already gotten the answers he wanted. He wondered if he was okay with that. As those unfamiliar words began to make sense to the protagonist, he found a way to reverse his life. And so he asked Jonathan if that was really the case. Before they could begin, he showed the stone lying on his palm and asked his opponents if they knew what it was. Jonathan didn't answer him. His eyes widened, and he frowned in confusion. The protagonist explained that it was an artifact that was rumored to be the rollback stone. Jonathan asked in shock and turned to his comrades, unhappy that they were just standing there. He ordered them to kill MC now, but he had already activated the artifact, and from it began to emanate light, which gradually became brighter. The protagonist, laughing, offered Jonathan to meet in the past. He begged that it was the moment before the disaster, or at least the time when his brother and sister were still alive. At the moment, he finally looked away from his memories and raised his hand, noting that he had entered the world of the past, having spent 23 years to return. In the end, he told Kong Ho his name, thinking that this was still the same world that was on the verge of collapse due to the gate and monster attacks. But still, life goes on. Kong Ho smiled through force, looking at his outstretched palm, and took his hand confidently, squeezing it. This time it was different, and Kong Ho frowned in concentration, declaring the system transfer and named the target as MC. Energy spread from his side, raising dust in some places. And the system warned that the system transfer was starting, but would lead to the destruction of the creator's physical body. That's why it asked Kong Ho to confirm the execution of the command. But he chuckled and noted that he was still a dead man. And so he confirmed the transfer. Since he initiated the system transfer, a new user, Junhyuk, was registered, and streams of magical energy began to converge on him, enveloping his entire body. The creation of a second system original and the transfer of the master copies began. The system began to scan the body of a user, Junhyuk, and he himself suddenly frowned, looking at Kong Ho, who said that he should not let down his guard until the very end. Because although the transfer had already begun, if he was not careful, it could be canceled. The protagonist asked in shock, and at that moment, the wounded monster began to rise behind him, and he froze, frowning. Kong Ho, who also noticed this, cursed and laughed, admitting that life was truly terrible. The protagonist turned around in fear, clenching his jaw, and the monster growled. And Kong Ho sadly added that in fantasy novels, people return home and live happily ever after. He called out to the protagonist, and he looked at him, and Kong Ho noted that he would have to forget about transferring the power and suggested that he just run away before it was too late. He was sorry that things were turning out this way, but at the same time, he knew that he had no choice. However, the protagonist ignored his words and looked around, paying attention to a bent pipe lying a little to the side. Kong Ho added that if life is terrible, then a person will have to live with it. And so he advised the MC to just adapt and survive. However, he took the pipe and stubbornly clenched his jaw, frowning in concentration. The fact that he did this surprised Kong Ho, and he asked him what he was doing. He assumed that the protagonist had gone crazy, but he explained that this was not the case, and he was actually well aware of what he was doing. In fact, he was tired of running away, and so he stood in front of the monster, who growled in displeasure but eventually turned around and began to walk away. Even MC was surprised that this happened, and afterward, he sighed in relief, admitting that he thought he would die from the strain. He threw the pipe aside, and Kong Ho admitted that they were lucky. But the protagonist was sure that it was all thanks to Kong Ho, because if the monster had not been critically injured, it would have attacked. And suddenly, he noticed that Kong Ho's body was gradually starting to dissolve. And he cried out excitedly, but he didn't pay attention to it and reminded him of his words, begging him to find his family and make sure to take care of them. He wouldn't forgive him even in death if he broke his promise. And he pointed at him with his finger in order to strengthen the impression of his words. After that, his body completely dissolved and the system transfer was 100% complete. The system warned that the user's body is not suitable for receiving the system, and it also completely finished scanning the user's body, Junhyuk, so the body restructuring through awakening began. He pressed his lips tighter, waiting for the transfer, and the system warned him to be prepared for the fact that the restructuring process may be associated with some pain. MC jerked, opening his eyes wider, and with difficulty holding back a scream, and the awakening started, but so far it is only loaded at 1%. Soon the MC was shaking. Each time he flinched more and more. He thought that he was trying to hold on, but in reality, it hurt much more than he expected. It felt like all his bones were breaking, and his flesh was falling apart. He arched his back, raising his head up, and screamed in pain. Sometime later, when the sun had already risen, outside the truck that Jiddle was driving came closer. Jickle cried out in surprise when he noticed the MC here and asked why he was here. The protagonist turned around when he heard the car coming closer and turned to Jichel, asking if he had really arrived. He brushed the dust off his clothes, smiling kindly, And Jichel frowned in confusion and asked if today wasn't the protagonist's day off. He remembered that the MC suddenly asked to switch shifts yesterday, so he came today. The protagonist admitted that he was going to go back, but then a monster appeared, so he got stuck here and missed his chance to leave. So he ended up spending the whole night here. Jaw let out a shocked cry when he realized that the protagonist had spent the whole night here, and he assumed that he was tired of living, but he smiled, telling him to forget about it, because thanks to this, he hit the jackpot. He laughed, and Joel didn't understand why he was acting like this. Meanwhile, the MC asked in surprise why Jichel was here at this hour. The thing is, it was a bit early before the workday started, and the protagonist was also wondering where the rest of the team was. Jig hesitated, sweating and scratching his cheek, trying to make an excuse, and in the end, he announced that he was waking up early lately, which is why he came so early. The others were also about to arrive soon, and Junhyuk understood everything but thought that the excuse about Jichel getting up early was nonsense, assuming that he was hiding something useful again. Jichel, meanwhile, remembered what Jung told him and began to tell the MC about it. He thought about Jichel being the leader of the hyena team, and he was the one who originally owned the ability of Spearmaster, which the protagonist stole today. Spearmaster was the ability to copy and use the abilities of other awakened. But Jichel could not use it properly, and Junhyuk assumed that this was why he gradually became an outcast among the other awakened until he was found dead in an abandoned building. In the end, he got into his truck, warning Gile that in that case he would go, and he wished him a good job. Jichel responded in kind, and MC thought that the reason for Gile's downfall was simple, and that was because Gile had revealed his ability to be a copy when he registered as an awakened. He knew that no one would tolerate his skills, which he had worked so hard to obtain, being copied so easily. Soon he was already on his way, his eyes focused on the road ahead of him. But he was briefly distracted by the crystals lying on the seat next to him. There were 3 B-class crystals and 4 C-class crystals. And although he felt a little ashamed in front of Jichel for stealing these crystals, he had almost died for it. So now he just had to figure out what to do with these crystals. Even if he just sold them, he could retire comfortably. But he couldn't do that since these crystals were useless to him anyway. These crystals were rare, and he remembered that Jichel, after awakening his power, was so shocked that he didn't even get to the trophies. However, the protagonist that evening, after awakening his new ability, collected the crystals by going from one destroyed monster to another. When Jichel returned the next day to collect the trophies, there were none. And every time he thought about that moment, he regretted that he didn't take care of the trophies. That was why the protagonist was so diligent in collecting all these crystals. In fact, he had planned to take the loot from the beginning. But now he thought if these were the cores of ordinary monsters, he could sell them carefully. But if he put the cores of high-class monsters on display, it would arouse suspicion. In that case, both the Awakened Association and the government would definitely start investigating where it came from. And in the worst case, he wouldn't even be able to get the full price of these crystals and might be forced to sell them for a pittance. Besides, there could have been a more terrible outcome, and someone would have taken aim at him, and he himself would have ended up as a corpse in an abandoned building. So he came to another conclusion and picked up the phone, dialing the number of the person he was going to talk to. In order to solve this problem, he had to quickly register as an awakened person. And at that time, Kang Chomin finally answered him and asked how he was doing. He wondered what he owed for such a busy man to call. The MC greeted him, explaining that he had finally been given money, and so he thought of having a drink with his friend. Coleman was surprised when he assumed that the protagonist would pay, and he reminded him that he had money and promised that he would throw him a feast of smoked pork belly. Coleman thought that this sounded great, but the protagonist warned that the freebie must first be earned, and Cholin asked in confusion what happened. The MC, meanwhile, drove up to the Soul Safe Zone and explained that Cholin had to do him a favor first. Soon the protagonist met the man and asked how much he was offering for the goods he had offered. This time, the items were very useful, so he was going to give him 600 coins for everything. The MC asked him to add a little more, since in their time, it was very difficult to find anything worthwhile, and he thought his interlocutor knew this. But he put his hand on his neck disappointedly, explaining that in the past, you could get 800 coins for something like this, but now it is too difficult since the number of people looking for expensive goods has sharply decreased. The MC froze in disappointment, and the man explained to him that the population is decreasing, prices are rising, and people are simply not spending money. Suddenly Chanjong and Chunch ran closer to them, bursting into tears, calling out to the MC. They clung to him, crying even harder, and Yin Chul asked why he only came back now. They thought he had abandoned them, and he seriously got their attention and frowned, not understanding what they were doing there. He reminded them that they were supposed to be at school, but the man asked why he was scolding them. He explained that they came here because they were worried about the protagonist not coming back all night, but he didn't answer him. And he added that money was good, of course, but the protagonist also needed to think about what would happen to these children if something happened to him. He finally asked them to stop crying and asked why they were crying. The children covered their eyes with their hands, saying that they were not crying. And finally, the MC suggested that they go home, promising that he would fry meat for dinner. He placed his hands on their heads, and they instantly became happy since they loved meat. Suddenly, Yin Young remembered something and told the protagonist that grandmother upstairs had told the protagonist to come see her when he returned. He realized that she was talking about the landlady, and she confirmed this by telling him that the woman had said that the rent was overdue. The protagonist thought about it and said nothing more. Soon they arrived at apartment 601 and placed the prepared food on the table. They were silent for a while, and eventually the woman excitedly asked why the protagonist had brought all this. He explained that he had gone to the butcher's shop, bought some meat, and thought of her. She remarked that it would be better if he saved it for the children. He did not respond to this, but handed her an envelope, apologizing to her for the delay and explaining that it was the overdue rent. However, the woman warned him that he did not need to rush since she was going to talk about it anyway. She knew that the protagonist had been having a hard time lately, so she decided to only charge him half the amount. He asked her in confusion, but warned her that there was no need. But Changa tried to dissuade him from arguing since they should all help each other in hard times. So he advised the MC not to be shy and just agree. The woman suddenly hit him on the head with a spoon, calling him a bastard, and asked if this was really his house. She reminded him that the house belonged to her and indignantly questioned why he was acting like the boss there. He put his palm to the spot where she had hit him and cried out indignantly, asking if she needed a spoon to scoop rice or to split skulls. He reminded her that after her death, the house would still belong to him. She angrily added that he didn't need to tell her that. He looked at the spoon in fear, screamed, and jerked, expecting the next blow. The woman added that because of him, her stomach was twisted into knots, and she couldn't sleep at night. In her opinion, he wasn't studying but running around doing nonsense that he called being a porter. Changa was outraged that she called it nonsense because he was sure it was studying. She didn't understand what he was studying, and he explained that he was learning how hunters fight in case he became an awakened. Grandma suggested that he study on his own first and asked why he was finishing college. MC watched their quarrel with a smile, and Chango added that now was the time of the awakened and the age of hunters. He was sure that his grandmother had no idea how this world worked. She didn't know what to do with him and asked that at least Junhyuk tell him something since Changu at least listened to him. MC suddenly felt his phone vibrate in his pocket and took it out, noticing an incoming call from Shulman. Meanwhile, the woman added that Chong Su was the only family she had left, but he was very immature. MC didn't say anything and went out to the balcony, accepting the call from Cholin. He reminded him of the business he had asked about before and explained that he had talked to the team captain, who said he should come by sometime. The protagonist happily asked again, and Cholin confirmed that this was indeed true, but added that it would be free. Instead, if the protagonist did well, he could be added to the list of permanent members of the team, albeit in a secondary role. He wondered if this was okay with him, and the protagonist agreed almost without hesitation. Cholin didn't immediately believe it was true and asked why he was suddenly acting like this. The thing was that he had never shown interest in being a porter before. In fact, the protagonist didn't have this interest even now, and he did all this for the sake of saving Cholin. But he explained aloud that working in the hyena team was getting harder and harder, so he began to look for other options. Coleman understood everything and said that tomorrow they were leaving at around 8 a.m. He warned MC to be sure to be near the 7th gate on the western wall no later than 7 in the morning. He understood everything and said goodbye to him until the next day. When he finished the call, he smiled because he was glad that everything was going according to plan. The next day, he approached the gate thinking about his plan because he was going to copy the tank skill today and go to the association. He suddenly heard someone calling him, turned around, and saw Chil Min, who was approaching him, laughing. He noticed that the protagonist had arrived quite early. He greeted him, thinking that after that, he would register as a tank and receive basic equipment. Cholin, meanwhile, turned to Yes Jin and explained to him that he was the friend he had mentioned yesterday. Sanjin understood and introduced himself, explaining that he was the captain of this team. He was older, so he assumed that he could address the protagonist in a more informal manner. He extended his palm to shake hands, noting that Cholin was addressing him respectfully, so he was going to do the same. He was looking forward to working with Sanjin today, and he responded that the feeling was mutual, asking him to try his best. After they shook hands, MC activated the copy, and the system explained that he could choose from 3 skills presented. The first was the unique passive skill Iron Skin Level 1, which added 1,000 points to defense, absorbed 10% of incoming damage, and could also be used without registering in the skill deck. He could also get an active unique skill Shield Strike Level 1, which hit the enemy with a shield, attracted their attention, dealt 300 points of damage, increased the aggression coefficient by 95%, and could be used without registering in the skill deck. The cooldown was 30 minutes, and this skill consumed 100 points of strength. The next skill was the active skill Card Suppression Level 5, which released a powerful aura that intimidated enemies and attracted attention. Thanks to this, the aggression coefficient was also increased by 130%, and the target's attack was reduced by 10%. The cooldown was 1 hour, and the amount of strength consumed to use the skill was 1,000 points. The protagonist decided to copy all 3 skills, and the system asked him for confirmation before starting the copy. He immediately agreed to it. Very soon, the copying of skills was completed, and the copied skills could be viewed in the skill menu. MC smiled as one handshake was enough time, and he was even happier that the job was done and he finally copied the tank skills. Sang Jin looked at him with a puzzled look, and Coleman Min also called out to him, asking what happened to him. He looked at them with a puzzled look, and Coleman asked why he was grinning like that while shaking hands. He thought it was weird, and Sangjin added that the protagonist had a great grip, and he laughed as he liked it. MC let go of his hand, apologizing to him for it, but he warned that everything was fine and suggested that they give it their all today. After that, he pointed to a truck standing a little to the side and said that the protagonist could climb up there. He looked at the team members standing near the truck and getting ready to go on a mission. Among them were Jang De-jin, Kongji Cho, Soyed Jin, Lee Dong-hyuk, Hisu, and the truck driver Sanjin. Sanjin suggested that the protagonist first greet the team members before heading to the hunting grounds. All the people gathered here were rank 1 awakened, and the MC smiled enthusiastically, although he knew that once he started copying the skills of higher rank awakens, the skills taken from these people would become useless. But even though that was the case, he decided that he needed to copy this for now, even if he deleted it later. Soon the truck was already on its way, and the protagonist, sitting next to the rest of the team, thought about it, counting that he had already copied 13 skills while they were driving. He copied 3 skills from healers and looked at Hisu, from whom he took it. He also copied 1 crafter skill, 2 catcher skills, and 7 attack skills. He thought it was incredible, but now he could perform the roles of a tank, attacker, healer, crafter, and catcher. Soon they arrived at a ruined part of the city where monsters were roaming. Sangjin, unhappy with the fact that the monsters were gathering somewhere, activated a shield strike, attacking a monster. Of course, the number of skills that the protagonist could take was limited, and having skills of different roles was a bit difficult. Meanwhile, Sanjin attracted Dong-hyuk's attention, suggesting that he use a long-range attack, and he immediately agreed and ran forward. Using skills of different roles, in the protagonist's opinion, was powerful depending on how it was combined. Dongguk, meanwhile, shot at the monster, wounding it, and Sanjin attracted Yajin's attention, telling her to finish off the monster. She understood everything and shot the monster, finishing it off completely so that it fell to the ground and did not move anymore. Sanjin praised them for their excellent work, calculating that there were only 2 opponents left. The protagonist had nothing else to do and decided to try activating something for fun. But he gave up on the idea, since once activated, he would not be able to change roles for 24 hours. He was going to register as a hunter right after this hunt, so he decided that there was no need to complicate things. Sometime later, the battle was over, and Sanjin laughed since another day had passed without any incidents. He praised everyone and also pointed out that the protagonist's stamina was very good. Today, they had an unusually large amount of offal compared to other days, but he was a little disappointed since this was usually the case. He suddenly noticed another porter who was bending over under the weight of his backpack, admitting that he was going to die. Chillman smiled, telling Sanjin that the MC was quite famous for his fists during his school days. Sanjin was surprised and asked if Chman meant the time before the disaster by school. He confirmed this, admitting that he had a sense for something like that. Technically, the protagonist did not even train, but still the so-called athletes ended up at his feet. The protagonist scratched his cheek with his finger in embarrassment, and Sunjun asked if he was a bully. He did not seem like that kind of person, and Coleman explained that calling Junhyuk a bully was too much since he was the one who beat up the bullies. The thing was, he had a dream of becoming a detective, and Coleman thought that if the world hadn't changed, that's probably what the protagonist would be doing now. In any case, Sanjin got off the topic by praising the protagonist for his good work, and he handed him an envelope with his pay. He asked him again, confused, explaining that he wouldn't take it as he had said so before. Sanjin told him to just take it and thank him for it, because if it weren't for the protagonist today, their porter would have a hard time. He wondered if the protagonist had already thought about continuing to work as a porter. He could arrange a position for him if he wanted it, and the protagonist smiled as he accepted the envelope, promising that he would think about it. Sangjun started to walk away, suggesting that they meet again sometime if the opportunity arose. When he left, Coleman complimented Junhyuk on his work and asked if they would go to the barbecue as agreed. He apologized to him, but explained that he already had plans for today, so he would treat him to meet next time. Coleman was surprised that he had plans and tried to find out more about it, but the MC did not tell him, and Coleman disappointedly asked him not to tell him that he had a date. Sometime later, the protagonist had already arrived at the sole branch of the Awakened Association, approaching the stand only for tanks. The girl who looked at him with confusion remained silent and even opened her mouth in surprise. The protagonist did not say anything either, and in the end, she asked him to repeat what he just said. He explained that he had come to register as an Awakened, and she noted that this was a registration desk for tanks only and asked if he was sure that he had awakened as a tank. He confirmed this and added that he had awakened as a tank today. The girl looked at him thoughtfully, and he, surprised by her reaction, asked if something was wrong. She excitedly cried out, explaining that this was not the case at all, and explained that the protagonist was the first person to awaken as a tank in the last 6 months. She finally got over her emotions and smiled kindly, congratulating him on this, and asked if he had brought his ID. He confirmed this, and soon he was handing her the documents. She pointed to a bench a little to the side, asking him to sit there and wait a little. Soon MC followed her recommendation and lowered his head, thinking. He gradually became sadder and thought that after returning, when he first opened his eyes, he thought he was dreaming. He grabbed his hair and lost himself in memories. When he was in prison, his brother and sister came to visit him, and then he cried when he learned that they died in a car accident. He remembered the moment when he sat on the floor of the cell, hiding his face in his hands and crying. The death of his brother and sister was decisive in his decision to become a villain, and he changed radically very quickly. However, when he came back and saw his brother and sister alive, He felt a lot of joy, and at first, he even thought that it was just a dream. He remembered the moment when he saw his family again, and now he frowned determinedly, promising himself that he would never lose his loved ones again. He was going to protect them at all costs, and clenched his hands in a fist resolutely, looking straight ahead. Suddenly, a system window appeared in front of him, and he examined it. According to the reports, the stamina ranged from the lowest at 6,000 points to the highest at 15,000 points. The strength was randomly assigned between 2,000 points and 5,000 points, and the protagonist stats were the maximum for the first awakening. He chuckled to himself, thinking that this was a good start. He was also attracted by the inscription about the formation of the core, and he thought about it and asked himself, "What is this?" He put his hand on his chin, but he still could not remember Giles mentioning anything like this. But in the end, he did not think about it for long and decided that he would find out about everything when the formation was completed, since it had already begun to form. Finally, the girl, who had become accustomed to his attention, approached him. He looked at her thoughtfully, and she returned his ID card to him, explaining that they had finished checking his identity. She pointed to Lim Junhyuk standing next to her, asking the MC to follow him for the test. Junhyuk greeted him and extended his hand for him to shake. The protagonist admitted that it was nice to meet him, and they shook hands. Junhyuk explained that they had prepared everything in advance, so they could start the test now. They walked to the elevator to get to the right place, and the protagonist looked at Junhyuk with a studious look, noticing that he was not an awakened one, so copying him was impossible. He thought that Ji-hun must be awakened if he was working for the association, but it turned out that there were also unawakened personnel here. He looked at him like this the entire way. Finally, they moved to a room where he lay down on a special couch. Junhyuk told him that the test consisted of 3 stages. The first stage was to measure strength and endurance. For this, he attached special wires to the device to the protagonist. When the preparations were complete, Junhyuk began the measurement, and the protagonist froze without moving. After a short silence, Junhyuk warned him that it would take about 10 minutes, so he advised him to just relax. After that, he told him about the second stage of the test, which involved using the active skill of a shield strike. Soon the protagonist, dressed in a tracksuit and armed with a shield, stood in front of a mannequin representing a monster. Ji-hun, as well as the other researcher, were watching from the other room. And in the end, Ji-hun also added that this test included measuring the aggression level. Measuring the aggression level was simple, and Junhyuk just needed to use his skill on the monster dummy in front of him. He took a fighting stance, frowning in concentration, and Junhyuk clarified that it didn't matter which part of the dummy he hit, so he didn't have to be shy. MC activated his shield strike, attacking the dummy, and both researchers' mouths opened wide in surprise. The final step of the test was the third stage of evaluation. Soon Junhyuk had already brought MC a glass filled with a hot drink and handed it to him. Noting that due to the problem with the evaluator selection, this last stage of evaluation would take place in 2 days. The protagonist, while accepting the drink, asked, "Is that really all?" Today, the tests were indeed finished, and Giant explained that the protagonist needed to go to the counter, and they would provide him with basic equipment. He couldn't even believe that the day had actually come when he would receive the association's standard equipment. Junhyuk sat down opposite him and admitted that he was worried about the decrease in the number of awakened tanks and healers. Compared to 5 years ago, during the Great Disaster, the number of healers and tanks had dropped significantly. The protagonist took a sip and widened his eyes, looking thoughtfully at Ji-hun, who looked back at him seriously and said that even though the forced awakened people created with awakening stones would join the ranks of hunters, most of them focused on attacking or supporting roles. Not to mention that awakening stones were not that easy to obtain. Awakening stones for tanks and healers were especially rare. But the biggest problem was that even with an awakening stone, there was no 100% guarantee that a person would awaken. The protagonist knew this well, because he was lucky enough to obtain this stone and awaken while he was wanted as a criminal. When he remembered this, he became more serious and noted that after becoming a villain, He could no longer register as an awakened person. Jian suddenly smiled excitedly, scratching his cheek with his finger, and apologized to the protagonist because it was a long time since he met a tank, so he was overly happy, although he was usually not so talkative. However, the MC thought that everything was fine. Soon he stood up from his seat to leave. Juno warned him that the third stage of the evaluation was scheduled in 2 days, so he asked him to come on the right day. The exact time will be sent to him by text tomorrow. He extended his palm to the male lead for a farewell handshake. He looked at it thoughtfully at first, but soon smiled and admitted that he was looking forward to working together and shook Jian's hand in return. Sometime later, in Old Gyro, the male lead was walking while holding the equipment he had received. He called Cholin and asked if it was convenient for him to talk. He confirmed that it was convenient and asked what happened. The MC explained that it was nothing serious, but he had just suddenly woken up like a tank on the way home. Choman seemed not to understand what he had just heard at first and so reacted calmly. But then he cried out in surprise and asked again. He assumed that the male lead was joking, but he would not joke about something like that. He walked into the store while still talking, assuming that this was the place he was looking for. Coleman asked him at this time if he really woke up as a tank. MC pointed out that he had said this before, and Cholin let out a surprised cry, noting that it was unbelievable. They had only separated a few hours ago, so it was even harder for him to believe what was happening. MC suddenly froze, even with his mouth slightly open in amazement, when he looked at the item he saw on the counter in front of him. Chillman, meanwhile, again noticed in amazement that the protagonist had become a tank, but he did not answer him. So Chillman assumed that the call was disconnected. The protagonist, meanwhile, was focused on the model of the praying mantis's front leg, which cost $3 million. He cursed, not even understanding who would pay $3 million for this garbage. He assumed that these people were crazy, and in the end, he was distracted from his thoughts as Cholin tried to call out to him again. The protagonist said that he could hear him now and noticed that the connection was cut off for a second. He finally explained that he went to the association today and registered as an awakened. He also said that he was told that he would have a test for a rank 3 tank in 2 days, and he thought that watching veteran hunters hunt might help him. That was why he asked Coleman if he could join his team as a porter again. While talking, he was looking through the shelves, looking intently at the items on display, and Cholin asked him if he hadn't seen enough of this today. He explained that he had been too focused on carrying things to properly watch Sanjin's fight. Finally, he found the item he wanted, which was lying on the display case, and Coleman thought about it and asked if that was really the case. He finally asked him to wait for a bit, promising that he would explain the situation to Sanjin and get back to him. MC thanked him for that, and then went to the cashier and explained that he would like to get a bracelet and a solution. If he was not mistaken, it was an artifact that was once owned by Jaden Russell, who was a rank 3 villain. He remembered how he sat at the same table with Russell in the past, before returning to a time when the protagonist was a rank 8 villain. He once managed to drink with Russell, and then he told him about how he acquired the bracelet and also talked about its main functions. Now the seller narrowed his eyes, looking at him thoughtfully, and MC was distracted from thinking about how you can increase the effectiveness of skills by 30% just by equipping this bracelet. He asked the seller what happened. He did not understand why he was looking at him like that and assumed that something was wrong. The man apologized to him for asking, but asked if it was true that he had registered as an awakened today. The protagonist said that it was indeed true, and the man suddenly swung his fist, noting that he knew it. The protagonist froze in fear, and the salesman suddenly smiled kindly and said that he was also unawakened, and his ability was teleportation. The MC replied that he understood everything and asked himself in shock, what was that? He eventually figured out that it was a punch, but for a second, he thought that the salesman was attacking him. He eventually pressed his fist against the man's fist, activating a copy, since the teleportation ability would be useful to him. The second salesman, Huang Mansu, introduced himself and also extended his fist forward, saying that he was an awakened with the ability of spatial manipulation. He was pleased to meet the protagonist, and he responded in kind and was happy about the ability of spatial manipulation since it was exactly what he needed. He used the copy on Mansu as well. Soon another salesman admitted that he had overheard the protagonist's recent conversation, and he assumed that if he was taking the tank test, then he was one. He wondered if that was really true. Manson noted that tanks were actually nobles among the awakened, and he laughed, admitting that he even envied the protagonist. MC never thought that he would meet awakened people here, and he asked if this was a part-time job for them. However, they both answered at the same time that this was their main job. He was surprised and even did not immediately believe that this was really true. The man sighed, explaining that with so many awakened people with utility skills, it was difficult to find a job, and besides, his ability was not very useful in battles. Mansa became the owner of a shop selling antiques and supplies for awakened people in order to make a living. The protagonist finally understood everything and guessed that they were having a hard time in the job market. Finally, the shop assistants placed the solution he had requested in front of him. They calculated that the bracelet and the solution together would cost 350,000 coins, but offered him a discount, selling it for 300,000 coins instead. He thanked them and thought that with this, he had collected all the materials needed for unsealing. The bracelet, the solution, the crystals above D-class that he had at home, and his blood as a binder for everything. Soon, he finished all the preparations, and the resulting artifact was in his possession. He put the Twilight bracelet on his hand, admiring it with delight. Suddenly, a system window appeared next to him, announcing that the 38th artifact among the 101 artifacts created by the owner of the original system had been unsealed. The Twilight bracelet was registered as an installed artifact in the system, making a total of 16 artifacts registered at this point. The protagonist could now see the options of the registered artifact. The Twilight bracelet was linked to the user of the second original system, Junhyuk. Since it was unsealed by the user of the original system, the item was completely unlocked. The protagonist didn't fully understand what the system meant when it mentioned the 101 artifacts created by the owner of the original system, but he was suddenly distracted from his thoughts as Coleman called him. At first, he was startled by the sound of the incoming call, but eventually he picked up the phone and greeted Coleman. He sighed and explained that he had told Sanjin everything about it. The protagonist froze, listening attentively. Coleman said that no matter how much he explained, Sanjin dismissed it as nonsense and claimed it didn't make any sense. That's why he warned that he would only believe it if he saw it with his own eyes. The protagonist smiled happily and asked if Coleman was joking. He had already assumed that Sanjin had refused. Coleman suddenly laughed and noted that the protagonist was very straightforward. Meanwhile, he activated spatial manipulation, and a portal appeared in the air next to him. Coleman warned that they would meet tomorrow morning at 7 a.m. near the 7th gate. He assumed the protagonist knew where it was and reminded him not to be late. Reaching into the portal, he pulled out a suitcase with equipment and replied that he understood everything. Afterward, he said goodbye to Coleman until tomorrow. The next day, near the appointed place where the rest of the team had already gathered next to the van, the protagonist appeared and greeted them. Sanjin and Coleman froze in shock, their mouths agape as they looked at him. Coleman noticed that the clothes suited him, and Sanjin realized that it was true. The protagonist had awakened as a tank. Coleman gave him a general outline of the situation, but he still couldn't believe it had happened in just one day. The protagonist laughed, agreeing, and explained that he had suddenly awakened yesterday on his way home. Sanjin had heard that the number of natural awakenings had dropped significantly lately, and he was very impressed. The protagonist had already told Coleman about this, but now he informed everyone else that he would be taking a test to become a rank 3 tank the next day. That was why he had come to watch Sanjin command and tank, as he thought it might help him. He apologized to Sanjin for bothering him again. Sanjin thoughtfully put his hand on his chin and realized the protagonist wanted help. He wasn't sure if the protagonist could learn anything from him, but he decided to give him just one piece of advice. As someone who had started doing this earlier than him, Sanjin asked the protagonist if he knew why he was wearing that shield. It wasn't because he had suddenly awakened as a tank, but because it was his choice. He was sure that when a person encounters monsters, there would inevitably come a time when they would feel tired and exhausted. And at such times, one should remember that it's not skills or stats that can bring someone back to the ranks. It's a person's determination. The protagonist listened to him with a smile, and Sanjin frowned seriously to emphasize the weight of his words. Sometime later, they arrived at an area inhabited by monsters and noticed a monster sleeping in an empty square. Ji-hun, peeking out from around the corner, turned to his comrades and asked if they had identified the type of prey and its location. They confirmed it was a drone, and he understood everything, then suggested they begin. He turned to Daeon and asked him to check the monster's location again. Daeon firmly replied that he understood everything and summoned the map. Sanjin looked at it, confirmed the monster's type, and turned his attention to the glowing dots on the model, noticing that there were 2 F-class drone monsters. As far as his comrades knew, these monsters had low attack power and sluggish movements, but their defense was as high as E-class monsters. The protagonist looked at his other teammates with concentration. Coleman suddenly cried out sadly because he doubted they had enough strength left to deal with the drone. Donnick lowered his head, already feeling exhausted, and wondered how long it would take to break through those shields. Someone asked if this was okay, and Joel worriedly said that at this distance, if something happened to the other team, even the drones might run at them. There was indeed such a possibility. But Sanjin warned that their prey was slow, and Sunham's group was one of the most experienced veteran teams in the field. As long as they did the same as always, there should be no problems. Who smiled and guessed that if the drone's attack power was low, she, as a healer, would have an easy day. However, she also guessed that the attackers might have a hard time and laughed. Sanjin drew Ji Cole's attention to himself and asked if all the traps were set. He replied that everything was ready, and Sanjin called Coleman and Junhyuk to follow him. He told the protagonist and who to stay behind. The protagonist seriously replied that he understood everything, and the rest of the team began to approach the monster. The protagonist had a feeling that something was wrong and frowned. Although he didn't know all the details, he remembered that the reason Coleman's team was destroyed before returning to the past was due to another monster's invasion. However, if the invading monster was a drone, they should be able to handle it. So, he didn't understand how they were all destroyed. He looked around intently, certain that something was amiss. Eventually, Sanjin called out to Eugene and asked if she was ready. She replied that she was, and in that case, he told her to start shooting. She aimed and fired at the monster, but the arrow didn't hurt it much. Eugene frowned and announced that she had hit the drone and was now moving on to the next target. Sanjin closed his eyes, sighed, and realized that everything was happening as he expected. The sleeping drone woke up, stood up, and Sanjin warned the others that the monster was coming. He ordered the ranged attackers to prepare. Coleman and Junhyuk responded. The monster swung its paws to attack, and Junhyuk fired several arrows into the monster's body at once, causing the drone to scream in anger. Junhyuk exclaimed that the strike was excellent, and his comrades praised him for the good shot, but warned him to keep his distance. However, despite their advice, he shouted that he was moving forward and headed toward the monster, ignoring their attempts to convince him that it was too early and that he should stay back. The monster swung its paw in anger, but Junhyuk dodged it and asked how much longer they were going to poke the drone in the back. He wanted to get it over with and go home. So he shot the monster a few more times, hitting the target perfectly. The drone tried to attack him a few more times, but he dodged and shot again. His comrades didn't give up trying to dissuade him and suggested he stop angering the monster and listen to them. He noted that he wasn't angering anyone. After all, the monster was so slow that it wouldn't be able to hit him anyway. Meanwhile, the drone swung, delivering a powerful blow, and Junhyuk was unable to dodge. He flew into the wall, and Coleman excitedly called out to him, but he didn't react. The rest of the team cursed, realizing that Junhyuk had provoked the monster. Coleman warned that he was also entering the nearest distance and approached the monster from behind, jumping up to strike. He frowned in concentration, but when he plunged the dagger into the monster's body, he was unable to do much damage. The drone only became angrier and growled. Coleman, who had fallen to the ground, cursed and warned the others that the drone's shield was too strong, so nothing was helping. Meanwhile, The monster continued to focus its attention on Junhyuk, who was leaning against the wall, exhausted. Gradually, the drone, growling threateningly, approached him and swung its paw to deliver a decisive blow. Junhyuk, noticing this, screamed in fear and put his hands in front of himself to somehow protect himself. But Sanjin arrived in time, using a blow from his shield to approach the monster and hit it with such force that the drone flew to the side, lost its balance, and fell, raising clouds of dust into the air. Sanjin himself frowned in concentration so as not to miss the monster's further movements. The area was quiet for a moment, but the monster soon stood up, angrier than before, and began looking around for a new target. Finally, it focused its attention on Sanjin, who called out to Junhyuk and Min, explaining that he would provoke the drone toward him. He ordered Min to prepare for long-range attacks and Yejin and Junhyuk to prepare for close-range attacks. They acknowledged his orders, and he used suppression. Waves of energy began to spread out from him, provoking the monster, which opened its mouth wide, showing sharp fangs, and growled. Sanjin frowned, realizing that he had managed to provoke it, and the drone began to swing its paws, striking him. He put up a shield in front of himself and screamed, but managed to stand his ground and block all of the drone's attacks. Once again, as the monster raised its paws to strike, an attack flew past its body. Junhyuk warned Yejin that they should act now. She responded, indicating that she understood, and took aim, pulling back the bowstring of her weapon. Finally, she fired, hitting the monster's head directly. Although no obvious damage was done, the drone trembled in discomfort before curling up, exposing its hard shell and protecting its more vulnerable parts. Sanjin ran toward the drone, shouting to Min that he should use a long-range attack. Min shouted that he was already prepared, and from both sides, they ran toward the monster, raining down more blows on it. Sanjin warned everyone to continue with basic attacks until the next command. Min, who was also trying to break through the monster's shield, cursed and admitted that just looking at the monster's back was already tiring him out. They continued to strike, suggesting that the monster should just die already. The protagonist continued to watch them from the side, remaining silent and lost in thought, who suddenly sighed, closing her eyes and lowering her head because she understood that if this continued, it would be the end of their hunt today. It seemed like a big disappointment to her, and she didn't understand why something like this always happened to them. The protagonist didn't understand what she meant when she said this always happened, and she explained that the drone was not a monster that appeared often. She put her hand to her head excitedly, noting that if a person was unlucky, they might encounter a drone once or twice a year. The protagonist looked at her carefully and asked how many times their team had killed such monsters. She told him that their group had encountered a drone for the third time in the last 5 months, as if they were cursed or something. Suddenly, she was distracted from her dejected mood and chuckled, noting that judging by the protagonist's questions, he was eager to learn something new. He apologized to her, assuming he might have bothered her with his questions, but she didn't seem annoyed. On the contrary, she handed him a device that could help him. He was surprised when he realized it was an M7, who told him that the official name of this device was the Jeremy M7, a measuring device developed by Jeremy Corporation. The protagonist looked at the device in amazement, his mouth dropping open in bewilderment. Who smiled, reminding him that he was there to watch them hunt before his third test. However, she didn't think it was appropriate to just stare, so she asked if he agreed with that. Using the M7 to analyze stats, she thought could really help the protagonist. Instead of answering, he picked up the device and put the lens to his eye. Looking at the battle going on with the M7, his mouth dropped open in shock. Who announced that, for example, the drone's health was 30,000 points and its shield was 150,000 points. Thanks to the device's effect, the protagonist could see these stats next to the drone's body, who suddenly became sad again, closing her eyes and lowering her head. She said that 30,000 points of health was a lot compared to most monsters, and a shield of 150,000 points was completely discouraging. The protagonist frowned in concentration, realizing that it would take forever to break through all of this. But he was suddenly distracted from his conversation with Hu as someone screamed in shock, not understanding what was happening. Daeon drew the attention of the others, warning that they had a problem. Sanjin didn't understand what he was talking about when he mentioned a problem, and Daeon announced that the life signals of the 4 team members on the other side had disappeared from the map. Sanjin asked in amazement, guessing that Daeon's words meant that Sunam's group had been destroyed. Daeon frowned seriously, and the protagonist, standing nearby and hearing everything, widened his eyes in surprise. He was horrified that the other team's indicators had disappeared, and he abruptly turned around, focusing his attention on the warehouse, standing a little to the side. The walls of it gradually began to shake, and after a while, cracks appeared, which grew larger and larger. Finally, a hole appeared in the wall, and a bloody monster emerged through it. The rest of the team realized that praying mantises were coming, and they screamed in horror. One of the monsters crawled out of the building completely, and the protagonist, watching this, mentally exclaimed that this was bad. The others still couldn't believe that the praying mantises were coming here, and they cursed over and over again, wondering how much time was left before these monsters arrived. Meanwhile, the praying mantis stretched its limbs, preparing for a quick dash. Daeon thought that the mantis would arrive in 3 minutes at most, but he immediately corrected himself, warning that these monsters could appear even earlier. He was genuinely scared, beads of sweat appearing on his face from excitement. Sanjin warned the protagonist and Hu to leave and find somewhere safe to wait. The protagonist didn't react to his words at all, but realized that the uneasy feeling he felt earlier was due to the fact that they were dealing with praying mantises. Stubbornly clenching his jaw, he thought deeply. Meanwhile, Sanjin ordered Yajin to hold her position and told Jikol to prepare the binding traps. The protagonist grabbed Hu's hand and pulled her to the side, warning her that they needed to leave. She was also very scared, her eyes wide and sweating from fear. She didn't immediately understand what was happening, but eventually agreed with the protagonist. However, instead of moving further away, he ran toward Sanjin and the other team members. They noticed this, called out to him, ordered him to stop, and asked where he was going. The protagonist didn't stop, but turned toward them and explained that retreating at such a distance was almost impossible. If the mantis caught them, it would tear them to shreds. As he said this, Sanjin also noticed that they were approaching him rather than following orders. He called out to Junhyuk, assuming he hadn't heard him, and reminded him that he had told him to retreat. But the protagonist stubbornly stood in front of him, putting his shield forward, and warned that retreat was not an option because the mantis was too fast. They would still need another 30 minutes to deal with the drone, which was why he wasn't going to retreat. Sanjin frowned, pressing his lips tighter, but said nothing. The protagonist asked what would happen if the mantis showed up now. He explained that they would almost certainly be destroyed in that case, and got into a fighting stance, preparing to take the monster's attacks. The mantis was approaching them with rapid leaps, but the protagonist didn't move from his place, even when the monster was very close to him. He was sure that in this situation, all they could do was hold out as long as possible. He shouted this, frowned resolutely, and prepared to fight.